Neurips 2024, part 10. This is a paper about visualizing physics. Kaiming, the link's in the show note. The idea is that you take a 2D picture and you represent it in 3D with the physics. That's the key. Kaiming has been giving these presentations across the academic world, so I've been following him, and there's a couple of episodes in the past about his papers. He's pretty interesting to us because I'm going to give the line of thinking here and then talk about the paper. So first about the line of thinking. So what we're trying to do is find a representation of reality that is that has physics fidelity. So you have a virtual representation of the world. A glass falls on the floor and breaks in virtual world exactly the same way it would break in the real world. A car hits a wall, a person jumps into the water deforms in waveforms. We want to be able to represent reality as in virtual form, as real as possible. Why do we want to do that? Well, there's two applications. One is games and movies, and the other is simulation. And why do we want simulation? Because we see a future, and this is paraphrasing Jensen Huang, when designs, physical designs, are done in virtue, and then lastly taped out when we are very confident that we have a good representation of a particular product, and then the tape out is the actual physical representation of the product. And what does that do? Well, it increases the speed of iteration dramatically, and that, of course, is the North Star. We at Orange Capital Partners have been investing in these types of technologies for a while because we think that real-world AI is a very interesting field that has huge repercussions for wealth creation, and that's the mission of the fund. So this is the line of thinking. Now, let's talk about how Kaiming's work could be interesting for that. What he's doing in this particular paper is he takes a 2D picture of, let's take a porcelain vase. So you take a 2D picture of that, you just take a picture of that vase, and lo and behold, you can now use that vase, that picture, in the virtual world and manipulate it, drop it on the floor, it breaks. Let's say you take a piece of rubber, you can hold it in virtual world and it deforms the same exact way a piece of rubber would deform. I guess you get the picture. Now, what is the technique that is being used here? The technique that's being used in the paper is threefold. So you have, and there's a quote in the paper, that a picture is not just a geometric representation of an object. A picture is a point in time representation of an object relative to its external forces, internal forces, and what they call end-state geometry. So the way we understand this, to simplify this, is the following. Like, think about it this way. Like, you take a picture of a piece of, let's say, a vase. What is that? That is a representation of the vase's geometry, so the way it looks. This is what we do. This is what we know already. This is what companies like Autodesk are doing and other virtual design companies. You represent real products in virtual space, right? That's nothing new. That's the geometry. But what we also want to represent is the external forces. So we know this vase is standing on a table. So we know gravity. We know how that vase should act standing on a table. In other words, it's not going to fall up, right? It's going to be attracted to the table towards where the gravitational forces are pointing. Now, if we tilt the table, ideally, the vase should slip down and fall and then break. Now, how do we know that? And that's the internal forces. And the internal forces, that, in my opinion, is the biggest contribution of this paper. How do we model that? And now let's discuss this, how the paper is doing it, And then we want to transition to actually what we think is more interesting, which is what we call learned representation. So let's first talk about how they're doing it in the paper. So think about it this way. You can dissect the vase into a number of tetrahedral subsections. And those tetrahedral subsections all are defined by a graph model with vertices and edges. And those vertices and edges represent force vectors that are learned, that are known. So every material has its own representation of internal forces defined by the edges and vertices of these tetrahedral subsections. What that does now, it helps us combine all these vertices in sort of a graph model. And then when we, let's say, drop this vase on the floor, we should, in principle, be able to infer from the forces that act internally in combination with the force externally, so in this case, a gravitational force which acts on the vase, we should be able to infer the deformation of the phase. In other words, the transformation from the state of the phase in the initial state and then the transformed state. In other words, we should be able to infer that the state will break. The phase will break. The vase will break, So that's how this is working in the paper. Now, the way they're working with this is they're using, now you can imagine this work being done in two ways. One is the way they're doing it, which is that these internal forces, these deformation forces, are already have been studied in other areas, material science and things like that. So those are actual numbers, databases that you can lean on to. So you basically take a picture and you either label the picture, this is a porcelain vase, and then the model knows how porcelain acts and infers from the geometry how the transformation in combination with the external forces should act. Or, and this is our suggestion, you could actually learn these things. So you could, instead of relying on labeled deformation data, you could learn the deformation of materials. So in a perfect world, and this is now leaning on Richard Sutton's bitter lesson, right? Instead of us using priors or basically teaching the model things that we humans learned and sort of teaching the model how to learn physics the way we learn physics, which is, we know how porcelain acts, we kind of have a sense, and therefore we will act accordingly. How about we just teach the model from end to end, from scratch, without priors, how porcelain acts? Now, what does that require? Of course, and this is the holy grail of material science in AI, it requires data collection, data cleaning. It requires a huge amount of data collection of materials and the corresponding training. Now, that's not available right now, and that's why this paper is working with the available deformation data. Again, there is the same way that fluid mechanics has decades of experience in terms of how fluids act. We also have decades of experience how materials act, or if you will, fluid mechanics is just deformation deformation knowledge is just applied fluid mechanics inside the material. So it's how particles act or how subsections of the material act within the material, or in condensed matter physics, this would be the idea that we have if we put pressure on a material, then the inside of the material acts in a certain way, and that is how we infer its properties, right? And if we had a learned version of that, we could then do inverse design. We could say, okay, we want a material with this type of property, what should it be? And then it would give us the material. Ideally, we would go even deeper and ask ourselves, okay, what is actually the unit of analysis here? Is it the material? Or maybe the unit of analysis could be the periodic table of the elements. And we just say, okay, look, we want this type of performance, this type of behavior of a material. What kind of elements should we put together? In other words, how can we construct a material that acts accordingly? So this would be the holy grail of this whole work. which again, the North Star here is to be able to represent real physics by just taking a picture of an object. And the next step could be, of course, to not even have the picture of the object, but just define the properties that you're looking for in a particular material, and then you go from there and you create you have the model come up with options of what kind of material would be ideal to represent this type of property. And the idea behind this whole work is, and that's mentioned in the paper actually, it is simulation of real physics. Simulation of real physics, in my opinion, is the holy grail for real-world AI, and real-world AI can help us dramatically increase the speed of iteration with which we can develop real-world products and services. And that is, why is that important? Well, we could have much faster productivity gains in fields like car manufacturing, battery manufacturing, energy products such as batteries, transmission lines, construction. I just recently had the chance to talk to a professor for computational architecture, actually, which is very close to this area. And we spoke a little bit about this. Now, he was not as positive as I am on the AI side of things, but that's okay. He's coming from the architecture side of things, so he has to deal with all the problems of let's say, data collection, of lack of standards in the industry, of sort of a balkanization of the industry and those sort of things. But that's fair, and that's definitely part of the whole problem set here. But nevertheless, I think we have a framework by which we can approach the problem. And I think that's already quite a bit of positive news. So again, Kaiming, in my opinion, is one of those scientists that one should pay attention to. He's now at MIT. His work is interesting. It's difficult. This is real difficult engineering. This is, you have, let's say, when we use these tetrahedral mesh networks and graph representations of materials, we then have to use really complex partial derivative equations to actually calculate the deformation. But that's the game. I mean, this is real hardcore engineering. It sounds pretty intuitive on the big picture level, but when it comes to the actual nitty-gritty of execution, this is real engineering. And I don't want to diminish the difficulty of the work, but it's the right path. Thank you.